Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this critical engagement webinar series in which we discuss, debate, and evaluate the ever-changing body of knowledge emerging as a consequence of the current COVID-19 pandemic. It is where we put our minds together to consider and imagine the innovation that can emerge from it. I'm your host today. My name is Aviwe Mbobozi. I'm excited to host today's session with the Wits team in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, along with Health System Sciences and the Adler Museum of Medicine. So today's live session is titled the so-called Anthropause, Reconsidering Origins and Environments. In line with today's topic of reconsidering origins and environments, I thought it'd be fitting to introduce myself in sharing my path and the environments I've passed. So I was born in the Eastern Cape, Mthatha, a small rural town filled with hustle and bustle in the streets, rich with the Xhosa culture, which still lays the foundation, and it's a place where I call home. I then moved to KwaZulu-Natal, which was a different environment, lusciously green, full of animals. I remember one day coming back to the boarding school and there was a monkey on my bed, eating away at my bananas. So that was a bit of a shock. I then moved to Gauteng, and that's where I studied my tertiary studies. And currently, at the present moment, I'm a clinical associate, a PhD student, and a lecturer within the Division of Clinical Associates in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. So life as we know it came to a halt in 2020. All the freedom, the movement that we were used to, it was restricted and limited. So today we ask, can we take advantage of this? How do we build back better? And as urged by the UN and many governments across the world, the question is, how do we reduce inequality, social justice, and enhance sustainability from this moment onwards? We draw on the expertise of 3 Wits-linked scholar activists in the wake of the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference, which was in Glasgow, and we are delighted to have the guests here with us today. Our format is that our experts will present their insights for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. 3 sessions, or the sessions are recorded, and they're also uploaded on the Wits website. Our first speaker will be Prof. Amanda Esterhazen. She's a well-known scholar and public intellectual in South Africa. She's known as Mandy. She's an associate professor of archaeology in the School of Geography, Archaeology, and Environmental Studies, and her main research focus has produced a body of knowledge that has challenged historical perspectives and broadened archaeological insights. Her research outputs have focused on South Africa's changing socioeconomic priorities and how this is impacting on the practice of archaeology and affecting community relationships with their sacred sites and cultural landscapes. She's the head of the world-renowned Origin Center at Wits University. Second will be Celine Klinkert, who holds a BSc Honors in Biological Sciences from Wits University. She's completing a master's degree in her interdisciplinary field of wetlands. She's part of the dynamic NGO Sizanani HBCF, which is a youth-run community NPO based in Katlehong. It focuses on community upliftment through dedicated hands-on programs about plant and animal life and ecological activism and education. Our last speaker will be Siobhan Parusnath. He's a senior multimedia communications officer at Wits and Curiosity Pictures editor. He holds a PhD in biology from the Wits School of Animal, Plant, and Environmental Sciences. His research is on the conservation status of the sun gazer, a threatened lizard species. This has led to important changes to the national legislature on trading the species and helped create a network of safe habitats for sun gazer populations. So thank you very much to our guests, and I will hand over to Prof. Esterhazen.
Thanks so much. I'm going to try and share my screen, hopefully successfully this time. Can someone just give me a nod if you can see my slide?
Perfect, Prof. We can see it.
Great, thank you. So because I'm an archaeologist, I decided that I'd start off this talk introducing and talking a little bit more about the Anthropocene itself and what that means in terms of, or in the context of, a geological timescale. So geological timescales relate stratigraphy to time. So each unit of time is delimited by changes in the strata that correspond with significant events in the history of the Earth. So for example, mass extinctions, and you'll all be very familiar, I'm sure, about the mass extinction that occurred at the end of the Cretaceous before what is called the Paleogene. And that's when most of the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. So everybody tends to know about that. But what about the Anthropocene? So this term was first coined by Eugene Stormer in 1980s, and then it was publicized by Paul Crusson in 2000. And in 2008, it was put forward as a geological epoch. And in 2016, the Anthropocene Working Group then ratified this suggestion. But there's a huge amount of debate as to where the global boundary or beginning of the Anthropocene lies. In other words, where is the global spike that will allow us to say we can detect the influence of humans, anthro being humans, on several facets of the Earth system? So the surface, the oceans, the atmosphere, at a global scale. And the debates really sort of go around the pace and the nature of human impact. So for example, if I just put you in some kind of context as to how humans come into being, and of course, what the nature and the pace of changes are, if we look towards the middle of the Pleistocene here, that's when the first of the early hominins start leaving Africa. So they're not human as in Homo sapien, or Homo of any form, but they move out of Africa. By 300,000, we've got Homo sapiens coming into being, but at this particular point in time, we have a number of early humans on the landscape, all sharing the landscapes with Homo sapiens. But by 50 and 40,000, they've gone extinct. And so by 10 or 11,000 years ago, which marks the beginning of the Holocene, of course, we are it. We're the last of the hominins on the landscape. This particular point also marks the end of the last glacial maximum and of a period that some would call the beginning of the sixth mass extinction. So the Holocene, the debates are around whether the Holocene then should become part of the Pleistocene and the Anthropocene should be given more prominence. But once again, where does the beginning lie? And the main arguments have argued for 10,000 years ago, which is the point at which Homo sapiens are all over the Earth. And of course, the rest of the early humans have already gone extinct. It's also the beginnings of farming communities. By 8,000 years, we see the spread of farming. People are starting to change the landscape intentionally. And of course, there's slash and burn and early settlements. So people have made an argument that that is where the change is most noted and it should begin. Others have argued for 2,000 years ago. That's the beginning of the main religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and of course, of the main marketplaces and the spread of the global market at that particular point. Others have said no. Historians have argued 500 years ago is what we consider the beginning of capitalism, of imperialism, of colonialism. Of course, that changed people's relationship with land and resources. 750 features strongly because it's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And certainly advancements in technology occurring since then have had a profound influence on the Earth system. But in 2019, the Anthropocene Working Group motivated for the stratigraphic marker to be 1950. And this is, of course, the post-World or Second World War period, which they argue the impact of humans on the Earth system has increased and accelerated at a dramatic rate. So that is the period, of course, when we have maximum indication of sedimental change to the Earth. We have a human fossil record forming very strongly in the form of what they're calling Techno Fossils. Quite frankly, I think it's just a sexy name for a lot of what we throw away, our garbage. There's trace elements in the atmosphere and in the soil, and of course that occurs from nuclear fallout. So we can detect these things on a global scale, and they would argue that that should be the beginning of the Anthropocene. So what of the pause? What of this Anthropause that occurred during COVID? This period of hard lockdown, did it cause us to reset? Did we build back better? Are we going to build back better? Or are we simply pressing play and life continues as before? Certainly we know that this hasn't been the first of the pauses. And humans have recovered from many others, like the plagues, the bubonic plague, smallpox, 1918 Spanish flu, all of which had major impact on humans. The world wars as well, from which they then had to recover. And they've shown resilience and they've been innovative, and there has been some change, but certainly political and social systems have been very slow to dial back the impact on Earth's system. And I would argue it has not reduced necessarily inequality, brought about social justice, or enhanced sustainability on a global scale. The COVID Anthropause did provide an opportunity to observe and collect data in a world devoid of human movement, pollution, and noise. But as Searle and others have noted, it would be more accurate to say that there were multiple pauses that varied considerably both in space and time. And for some human animals, there was no pause. There was heightened anxiety and survival activity. And I think generally there's consensus or a sense that the ecological and biophysical effect that we witnessed during the lockdown will most probably be very short-lived. But I stand to be corrected by my fellow panelists. But it has also been widely argued that the Anthropause as a symbol may be more enduring, because environmental symbols and metaphors are effective at influencing long-term behavioral and political responses. And probably this was the first time in history that the experiences of lockdown were communicated and shared globally through images, through memes, through experiences. They were very widely spread. And so based on this, Young and others have posed a key question. And I think this is very important. They say, has the Anthropause, and here they're talking about the symbol or the metaphor, inspired people and governments to mobilize for meaningful reform? Or has it simply presented a misleading and too comforting portrayal of the resilience of nature and wildlife that will discourage action? And I, as a cynic, would argue that, in fact, it will cause people to believe, well, it became a symbol of a source of comfort. Those uplifting images of resilience and of new life, even fake life, became a symbol of recovery and a symbol of renewal or hope. And unfortunately, because it's part of the whole techno classes, the privilege to were able to share this kind of hope and resilience, I do believe then that it will also inadvertently support the status quo and justify yet another online purchase, trade-off, open another mine, disappointing outcome from COP26. In other words, I think it will allow us to ignore the role of particular political and economic systems that justify continued exploitation of the Earth system and its components. And I would argue it might allow us to avoid answering or simply not have a meaningful discussion about what the boundary, what that golden spike between the end of the Anthropocene and the beginning of the next epoch will in fact look like. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Esterhazen. I think there's lots to think about, and I'm hopeful that there'll be a lot of questions that can spark debate. Thank you for defining it for us and setting the scene for today. The next speaker is Celine.
Hi, I'm here. Sorry, my internet got cut off for a couple of minutes, so hopefully that doesn't happen during the talk. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, can everyone see and hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, the screen is visible. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, thanks. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to Aviwe for that wonderful introduction. I am studying at Wits University in the School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences. And my supervisor is Professor Barry Scholes. So I'm just going to be talking a little bit about the world in general, and then I'll go to the last bit of my talk is going to be what I'm currently doing in my MSc. But in the last 100 years of our species' existence, we have caused a lot of damage to our planet. And it has specifically been since the Industrial Revolution, where we started burning fossil fuels. But it hasn't only been this, it's also been a growing population, which has caused a demand for land and a demand for food. So there's been a damage of natural ecosystems like forests and grasslands. Some of this is for housing, for growing cities, and some of this is changing the land to agricultural land for providing the food that this growing population needs. So a large amount of our ecosystems have been damaged. And on top of that, we've now been using fossil fuels for the lifestyle that we have been living in the last 100, 200 years. There's been a rapid rate of technology development. There's been an increase in the way that people are able to live to better their lives, but also a demand for electricity and a demand to power all of the technology that we're able to use now. And through the burning of fossil fuels, we have allowed for the release of millions and millions of years of carbon that was stored in those fossil fuels from dead organic plant and animal matter to be released into our atmosphere. And the problem with this, and especially in excess amounts, is that carbon dioxide is an acceleration to global warming and the warming of our atmosphere. So that has accelerated the damage that we've caused to our planet. And we can, in a very simple way, describe this as we are over-consuming what is available on our planet. And just like when a virus enters a human body or an animal body, its goal is survival and it uses the resources that it has to survive. But when it over-consumes, the organism and its host that it's taking from is no longer able to survive, and the organism or its host dies. But when the host dies, the virus dies as well. And so the immediate threat that is on top of our species is not necessarily that the earth itself is going to go extinct, but that we are over-consuming for our species. The earth has gone through many changes through the millions of years time, and the plants that cannot survive due to the changes will become extinct and new animals will evolve. So that means the temperature down, controlling the average global temperature, everything that's in the COP26 is for a push for our species and the species that currently coexist with us on our planet to survive in the conditions that we thrive in. All right, so this concept came up when we started to realize that we have started to cause some damage to our Earth. The concept of sustainability became recognized in the 1970s, 1980s. And to this day, sustainability has been given lots of definitions, but has also stayed very vague. And that's because sustainability really can be, it can be given the definition to many different types of sustainability for a special livelihood. But in general, sustainability is basically the concept that we as a species are able to coexist with the species on our planet without over-consuming, that ourselves and future generations are able to use the resources, innovation of our ecosystems that provide us with food, with carbon sequestration, with water filtration, as well as sustainability into our species as a global species. So bringing renewable energy and clean energy into the way that we live. I'm just going to check here for 1 second. Are you all experiencing some lag in Celine's output, or is it just me? Okay. Can everyone still hear me? Just answer yes on the chat for me, because I did see it said my internet was unstable, but I'm not sure if it still is. But I'm just going to carry on unless you say you can't hear me anymore. And then bringing that into the sustainability, or sorry, yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much for replying. So bringing the sustainability into our world and trying to integrate it into how we work as a society is recognizing that there are 3 spheres, but they are not separate. They are all completely integrated, and no sphere can act without the other sphere being sustainable. And so here we have the economic, the social, and the environmental sphere, that for a long time, the economic sphere was thriving. The social sphere was thriving as we passed World War II, as people were getting a better quality of life, better food access, better education. But the environment was being broken down quite heavily, and the population was growing at a rate that the amount of food that was being produced wasn't coping. And so we started to cut back into the natural ecosystems that were available at the time and converted them into agricultural land and to building cities. So that 3 sphere is the main concept of sustainability in the society that we run today, that none of them can prevail over the other, because one then, or possibly 2, are being affected. And so we basically need to figure out as a society, how do we manage to have an economy that is developing, while people in the social sphere have a good quality of life, without the environment being the end and the backburner of that. And lastly, a big concept of sustainability, but not through the government, this is more a lifestyle of individuals, is zero waste. And this really is small lifestyle changes that you make. Woolies kind of enforced this by not allowing plastic bags anymore, and you have to bring your own bags. And zero waste is essentially just this idea to stop material packaging, plastic pollution, and it's a lifestyle that you are able to choose in whatever capacity you're able to contribute to this, where we reduce our carbon footprint as an individual, but also as a collective population. Ooh, that's not changing. Okay, so getting to this idea of the Anthropause and reaching a new normal. The Anthropause, as Amanda explained, is derivative from the Anthropocene, which is the era that we're currently in, and that the COVID pandemic really forced us into a space that we had never been before as a global society. We had to stay in our houses, we weren't allowed to drive around, we weren't allowed to visit our families. And very quickly, we started seeing a drop in carbon emissions, which was a very big thing because carbon emissions had just kept on going up regardless of the government promises that had been made, and regardless of the sustainable goals that had been agreed to by the different countries. Economic development had been prioritized, and so carbon emissions were continuing to go up. But when millions and millions and millions of people aren't driving around, there's no carbon emissions from cars, the carbon emissions started to drop. And for me, what's very interesting is that it was a way into seeing that when we are forced to change, when there's a threat that is very immediate and we have to make changes so that there's no dire consequence, we can. We saw it happen. We had to change the way that we live so that the pandemic could be controlled. And as a result, the environment was positively affected by this. And I think that this just shows us that when we have to, because I think many people feel that we can't change the way that we live and reach the temperature goals that we need to reach because it's too difficult, it's too extreme. But we are a very adaptable and resilient species. We are extremely intelligent species that is very capable of coping with the changes around us. And if it need be that we have to change for the sake of being able to exist on this earth without destroying it, I truly do believe that we can change, but that push needs to come from every government in the world, and it needs to be a global cooperation, the same way that the pandemic and trying to reduce the effects of the pandemic were during our COVID pandemic. So what does the future hold? The future holds many, 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 many solutions. And sustainability and this idea to go green, it's a very place-specific solution that many people don't really understand, that every sustainable solution does not fit every place in the world, and that the Northern Hemisphere's sustainable solutions for the problems that they are facing are not necessarily the Southern Hemisphere's. And so the Southern Hemisphere specifically has a threat of water drought and decreased water availability. And at the moment, we are living in a semi-arid environment and semi-arid country. And so conserving water is a very, very important part of our sustainability. And so we could do really small things like collect water when we shower and water our plants and not leave the tap running when we're brushing our teeth, and using grey water for smaller things that we don't need to consume the water. And that's just an important thing that we can bring into our lives as habits, but that make a big difference when an entire country is doing it and millions of people are participating. And then second is changing the way that we water our crops. Right now we have like mass watering through sprinklers, and a lot of that water gets wasted to the environment. And drip irrigation is a very good solution to not wasting water, because the water slowly drips into the soil where it's needed, and a lot of water is saved through this, and the crops are watered, and irrigation occurs just as effectively as it does. And then the third one is, because we live in such a sunny place, solar energy and solar panels and capturing that energy for electricity and the use and running of our country is such an accessible resource because of our atmosphere. And due to our increasing temperatures, something that has begun a very big push for is making the spaces around us more green, because having plants around us cools our average temperature down. And so going into a corporate environment where there are just hundreds of buildings like Sandton City is a very good place where they can start putting rooftop gardens on and growing bushes around and having vertical gardens along the side of the buildings, because that's something really small. It's a small change to the building that makes a very big change to the environment, when not every single floor and every single office is running an aircon, simply because you have a greener space. As well as mental health wise, being in a place that is more green, more connected to nature, it really does give you a sense of being a bit more free than being trapped in a concrete jungle. So that is an important thing that many of the European countries are starting to adapt, just green spaces. And lastly, this 5 zero waste policies of, sorry, 1 second, of reduce, reuse, recycle, rot being forming your own compost and not throwing everything into the garbage. If you have a garden, you can start to decay your own vegetables and things like that and create your own compost for your own garden. And it just reduces the garbage and the junk that's put out into the environment. Okay, so water is a very important part of our world. Obviously, life cannot exist without water, and clean and good quality water is also an important part of that. Let me just check the chat. Okay. So I'm doing my MSc on a wetland as part of environmental sciences, and wetlands are an ecosystem that are well adapted to high saturation levels of water, and the plants are able to cope with being completely saturated with water or partially saturated with water, or the transition between the two during the different seasons. So wetlands have different parts of the wetland, where the middle is usually remains wet, and these have aquatic plants that grow in the water. To the sides of that are wetland grasslands and shrubs and bulrush, that the water remains semi-saturated, the soil remains semi-saturated with water, but the plants themselves are not submerged in water. And then the outer banks of the wetlands are just wetland grasses that get used to occasional flooding, and that occasional flooding in those wetland grasses are a very good flood prevention for the houses along those banks. Okay, so wetlands provide ecosystem services, and ecosystem services is this idea that natural ecosystems can provide humans with services that increase our well-being. Every ecosystem has unique services to them. Wetland ecosystem services are things like flood prevention. The wetland is able to hold a lot of water, and so when there are floods, the surrounding houses do not get damaged. We got climate regulation and carbon storage, biodiversity support, as wetlands hold hundreds of animals and species, nutrient cycling, where the nutrients come through the water and they get cycled through the plants and the grasses. And lastly, and most importantly to my master's project, is water regulation and purification. So how do wetlands remove pollutants, and how do they purify water? Physical pollutants like plastics and things like that, those need to be filtered out with physical barriers before they enter the wetland. But the pollutants that we're talking about are chemical and biological pollutants, like domestic use water, which has a lot of phosphate because of cleaning agents, untreated sewage, which enters wetland streams, have a high nitrogen level because that is what's found in our feces. And so the phosphates and the nitrates that come in are used by the plants. They're taken in by the bacteria that live both on the plants and the soil. And so when water comes in that has excess nutrients because it has been polluted by its surroundings, the wetland is able to use these excess nutrients, and further downstream, the water now has less excess nutrients, which could be a risk for eutrophication. Okay, so I work on a wetland called Buckestream Wetland. It is at the boundary of the Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal province. It's not a very large wetland. It's about 5 kilometers long. And this is the portion of the wetland that remains continuously wet. And out to the sides and towards the mountains and the back, we can see the wetland has the bulrush and the grasses, which have the occasional wetness, but are not always saturated with water. So for my MSc research project, there's me in the field. I'm studying at Wits, and I'm being funded by the Global Change Institute. And essentially what I do is I go around and I collect water samples at the different sites. And this is to collect water to test the water quality. So what is my research question? My research question is to aim to understand and try to estimate how much pollution can come through, biological and chemical pollution, can come through the wetland, where the wetland can still remove the pollutants without affecting the healthy functioning of a wetland. And if we're able to estimate this number or quantity, we're able to prevent this amount of pollution coming to the wetland and degrading the wetland. And if we have this idea for the Buckestream Wetland, we're also able to take it to other wetlands in the country and prevent further degradation for the wetlands that are still functioning healthily. So how do we do this? I collect water samples, which is on the bottom left, and then I test them for pH, total dissolved solids, and the higher total dissolved solids, the less the quality of water. For instance, if there is a lot of metallic ions in the water, it will have a higher TDS. And so there's a certain cutoff by the government for water quality that says after this amount of dissolved solids in a water, the water is no longer healthy for drinking. So we use those parameters to see the water quality. And then the amounts of nitrates and phosphates found in the water that I explained earlier, where they come from, the higher those amounts are, the greater the pollution entering the water, which also gives us an idea of where the water quality is. And then the third thing that I test is basically for the presence of a bacteria group called coliforms. And coliforms has a particular bacteria called E. coli, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. E. coli lives in our gut. But when E. coli is ingested, especially for humans, through water, we can get very sick. We have diarrhea, we have vomiting, it disrupts the healthy functioning of our gut. And so having E. coli in water is really not healthy at all. And here we can see S1 stands for site 1, which is upstream, and S8 stands for site 8, which is downstream. And we were looking to see, is there E. coli present in the water? If there wasn't E. coli present, the water would be completely clear with a very slight yellow color, and it would basically look like apple juice. And here you can see it has a coloration of it blue, and any coloration other than that very slight yellow means that there are coliforms in the water and possibly E. coli. So we can see that the wetland is already not filtering out the E. coli. And this is very bad because about 2 years ago, it was effectively filtering out by an honors student who did the same project as me, just on a very small scale. And the E. coli was being removed at a very efficient rate. About 70% of the coli was running down the wetland. The wetland was removing the pollution, and the presence of E. coli was much smaller. So something is happening upstream of the wetland where large amounts of E. coli bacteria are entering, and the wetland is now no longer able to handle it, not functioning healthily, and that E. coli water is running downstream. So why does this matter? First of all, we still have populations and rural areas in the country where people don't have access to clean running water. They don't have access to water that has been purified by the municipality. And so they rely on natural resources like rivers and wetlands to get their water from. And this is just a safety hazard for them, where this is their livelihood to drink water from, and this water is very sick. Sorry, this water is very, I just got a message that I need to wrap up. Okay, I will do that. I'm actually at the end. And so what we found is that upstream water pollution is coming in, and it can be a health hazard to humans. And we are trying to find solutions for how we could stop the E. coli water coming in, and potentially how other ways that we can remove it from the waterways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celine. This is very, very interesting and really, really important. I think we shifted the perspective to talk about without the anthropause, when we have human activity, how much, I guess, like destruction we're doing to the environment. So there are sustainable solutions, and I hope we'll get more into it with the questions. So the next speaker is Siobhan.
Thanks, Aviwe.
Yeah.
All right, so I don't have any slides prepared. I'm just going to talk. Just for some context, Celine is my partner. We live in the same house. She's just sitting in a different room. And I have maybe, I don't know, I wouldn't say a less hopeful view on the world and lockdown and that sort of thing. Maybe just more realistic. I think my background is in conservation. So I've spent the last 10 years working on a lizard called the sun gazer, which is endemic to South Africa. And it's a threatened species because of what humans have been doing to its habitat. Humans have been poaching them for pets because they're such beautiful animals. And so I think at some point, you know, my viewpoints on my perspectives have become almost nihilistic, thinking that is there any real point to any of the the attempts that we make to preserve our wildlife, because you try and you work really hard to try and fix a problem such as poaching or habitat loss, and you have to wonder to what extent any of this can really be stopped. So having said that, I have not given up hope. So, you know, it's still something that's very, very important to me. But I think that this Anthropause period has been a very interesting way to really examine what happens if we reduce the impact of humans on the planet. And I think, again, here, looking at it, you know, at the start of this so-called Anthropause, there was a lot of positivity surrounding the impact that our reduced activity has had on nature, allowing nature to bounce back in certain ways. A lot of the videos and photographs, as Amanda mentioned earlier, you know, some of those were fake. They were not real examples of what happens when humans, you know, stop causing so much damage to the world around us. And the truth is that from the biologist perspective and the ecologist perspective, the Anthropause may be simply a time to conduct experiments and to see what happens when we're not there and when we're not affecting the world around us the way that we have been for the last few hundred or thousand years. Because in a way, the Anthropause has had a lot of positive repercussions on nature. So of course, you know, reduced carbon emissions and pollutants and that sort of thing is excellent. But there are also a lot of ways in which us taking a step back and almost being hands off from nature has actually caused problems. I mean, there are some critically endangered coral reefs in the Caribbean that are regularly treated with fungicides to prevent fungal infections from happening that wouldn't have happened if we weren't polluting the water. And you know, people stopping that fungal treatment while we were all stuck at home has caused massive die-off in those coral reefs. Similarly, rats have been a huge problem on islands such as New Zealand, where they've really decimated the wildlife. And there have been a lot of eradication programs to keep the rat numbers down so that the natural populations are allowed to recover in terms of their birds and their mammals and that sort of thing. But the eradication attempts have also been on pause. And so the rats have kind of gone rampant and have gone back to consuming the natural fauna in New Zealand the way that they would have many years ago before the eradication programs were going on. So you have to think about the whole thing holistically. And I think when you look at the broad perspective, what has the Anthropause meant for us and what has it meant for animals? And we talk about the and the environment. We talk about the concept of the new normal, right? That we are now all living in this new normal. We're never going to go back to life the way it was exactly before the pandemic has hit us. But in a way, the environment has been living its new normal since we, as a pandemic, started causing destruction in our own way. So I think, thinking about the effects that we've had on the environment in a positive way during this Anthropause, maybe almost conceited, thinking that, well, we've stepped back, let Earth go back to normal. Earth is not going to go back to normal, the supposed normal before us, because of what we've already done to the planet. And I think what it's done in a larger way, in a way that I think is more important, is not just the lowered the reduced emissions for that time period, or the lack of traffic and air travel and burning of fossil fuels. I mean, that's all going to go back to normal. Maybe it'll go back to even higher levels than pre-Anthropause because of us trying to catch up and go back to normal. But what I think we can take away is that the Anthropause has shown us that there are ways and there are solutions to the problems that we have created. There are ways for us to step back and let the planet breathe. And how does it affect us? I mean, if you think about your level of happiness, your level of stress and anxiety, perhaps it's worsened in a lot of ways because you've got so many more things to think about now as you go about the world. But perhaps working at home, spending more time with your loved ones, spending more time with your animals, being in your place of comfort, maybe that's reduced your stress and anxiety in a way. And in fact, some research suggests that, this apparent influx of animals in urban areas, or our noticing these animals that are coming back into urban areas, may not really be an effect of the animals coming back into urban areas, but more that when we are less stressed, less anxious, on the move less, we pay more attention to nature. There's been a boom in things like backyard birding. A lot of people have been streaming, webcams that are on birds' nests and in national parks. So in a way, I think what it's really done has forcefully put it into our faces and saying, we are part of nature. We have this effect on the world around us. And the way we treat animals, the way we interact with animals has brought about this pandemic. It's our fault. And I think that it's the fact that we can have this discussion now. Being involved in conservation, I've been giving talks about how we can reduce our impact on animals for 10 years. But now when we talk about this concept of the Anthropause, the concept of what our reduced activities have had on the planet, I think it really just has more of an impact, and it also gives us a more realistic idea of what we can do to be less destructive, to be less selfish, to use less, to consume less, and to be more mindful. So that's kind of my takeaway message from all of this, is that, yes, it is wonderful to see some of these success stories, but I think the average scientist, the average biologist or ecologist might tell you that this kind of temporary pause of a year or a few years on the larger scale of things may not really have this big impact on the environment as we may want it to, but it can have an effect on our thinking. And that's up to you. That's up to you to figure out as the world starts to go back to normal, what have you learned? And how can you reduce your carbon footprint? Can you live without all the air travel that you had before? Is it worth giving up a few international holidays to burn less fossil fuel? I mean, that's where you've got to think about, can you be selfless and give up your own enjoyment for the planet? So I will leave on that question, and I believe we will have some questions and answers now. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. I'm going to shoot right straight into the questions because we have about 7 minutes left. So this is a question to Celine. There's a concept of zero waste that has become a bit of a buzzword, but the question is really asking about how there's evidence that there's been a shipping of the waste from developing countries to places like Senegal. So, is the concept of zero waste practical, I suppose? And the person is just referring, highlighting that waste colonialism is still going on.
Yeah, that does occur, the problem that she's highlighting. Complete zero waste, I don't think can be achieved, especially in the society that we created. But I do think that we as individuals can take a very big stand to trying our best to demand less packaging. So for instance, Pick and Pay will package a lot of fruit and vegetables, and recently I've seen them do stuff like have bunches of carrots with just a paper tie with the barcode, and spinach and things like that, where the packaging really doesn't need to be there as much. And zero waste is really just on this idea of producing less waste, which comes from packaging and materials. So it is a personal decision, and there are things that we can do that aren't that expensive, but there also needs to be a very big government drive to enforce those companies to make a change.
Thank you, Celine. I'll ask the next two questions were in relation to your talk. The one was, how have the findings about the wetlands translated to urban living? And then, did sewage overflow stop during the Anthropause? If there is.
Yeah, so the sewage overflow came from an informal settlement that doesn't have proper sewerage facilities. And so the Anthropause really just made it worse because people were now at home and consuming more, and there's more domestic water. So no, it didn't stop during the Anthropause, but the sewage overflow that we previously knew about is not what's causing this E. coli bacteria. There's no informal settlements directly upstream, and it's something quite big that's causing it. It could be like agricultural waste runoff, something like that, that previously wasn't happening.
Thank you, Celine. I'm now summarizing the questions because of time. But I think to Prof. Esterhazen, there are questions that link to Wits as an institution to say, are there plans that Wits has made to reimagine the Anthropause? Are we taking a stance as Wits? And I think there was reference to Prof. Chersich, who was urging Wits to take a stand on fossil fuels.
Yes, I understand that there are some plans and there's a lot of talk, but again, all of these things need to be translated into some form of action. And generally these actions need to be fairly large and at a real global scale to make any difference. So once again, the issue of zero waste it has to happen at a global scale, because what's happening at the moment is one side of the planet is putting their junk on the other side of the planet. And that's not necessarily going to solve the problem in the long run. These early discussions, it's early days, and we'll see how it plans out at Wits. It would be interesting. It would be a really nice research, I think, to go into a small sort of community like Wits and see if it can actually make quite a big change.
Thank you. Let's see. There's the last comment that I can read from Tembisa. From the perspective of the Wits VC, what is the moonshot idea from this? There's an ad now circulating from Wits about conservation commitment on the radio about water conservation and related issues.
Once again, I think the intention is there, but we're yet to see how it's going to play out fully. And we have seen attempts to try and conserve things like paper, which from some perspectives have not really caused any conservation because people were forced to then just go and buy more paper themselves. So in the long run, these things need to play out, and then they have to be evaluated. And I think that's the key, is people have to continually evaluate them to see in actual fact if they do make the changes that we so desperately want to make.
Thank you.
Viewer, can I add in something very quickly there?
Yes, please, Siobhan.
Also, Kathy asks, how can the Wits centenary be used for the good of this in 2022? And just as, recently we have our new DVC for research and innovation, Lynn Morris, there are early discussions now to have an officer who will lead green processes and kind of transformation at Wits. So that's kind of it's a very early chat. I don't know if I was supposed to actually share that, but I think that, we're at a place where these things can't be ignored. And if we're silent about this, it speaks louder than, if we actually had something to say. So I think that Matthew's kind of work on fossil fuels has got everybody talking about this stuff and looking at where do we have solar panels, how are we using our natural resources. And last year there was this big thing on campus because there was a dassy that had appeared, and there were people that were trying to trap the dassy and people were trying to remove it, and there was this whole thing about the dassy, and people were losing their minds over this one poor dassy. And I think it just shows that we have a lot to do to really come to terms with the fact that we live in a world inhabited by other animals. And I think that Wits definitely is the kind of institute that will push an agenda like this, not for political reasons or for whatever else, but because I think Wits has a conscience, a sort of collective conscience. And I think that we're all starting to ask for more change, and Wits is listening. So I do think that next year will be a wonderful year for this to start happening and being a little bit more apparent as we go into our 100 years.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. It is 2:00. Thank you so much for such great insights. I know I learned a lot, and there really was different perspectives about the Anthropause, the implications of the Anthropause, and what's the next step, where to from here. And I hope that the participants also learned a lot. So please do join us. I think next week is the last session of the series. But thank you very much to the guests, and have a lovely day to everyone.
Thanks, Avive, and thanks everybody else.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.